Okay, as you've quickly figured out, Craig is not here, and we are desperate enough that I'm leading our class. Apparently someone thought Gay was leading class, so bear with me a second. There we go. Much better. Okay, before we get started, Stuart's going to lead us in a prayer.
Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time that we have together with the saints to be able to study the portion of your word. Thank you for the book of Samuel that we can read and understand how David was a king that was a man after your own heart, and how we can be like him in that aspect. Appreciate what we see about Saul and that contrast between Saul and David. Pray to help us to appreciate the kind of people you're looking for. Help us to be that kind of people. Pray to be with Barry as he helps us understand his understanding of the scriptures that he is going to talk about tonight. Help us to be able to participate and encourage one another. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
So to segue from the prayer, I would have liked more prep time.
Excuses.
Exactly, get those out early, so I don't know if this mic's going to cut out or not. Stand by. Thank you. So I apparently put it on standby. All right, now I know. Anyway, segueing from the prayer is please help, right? I know Craig often will more lecture and a little bit of comment for us, but I'd love for this to be more participation and feedback from you guys to help me through this. So I did want to spend a little bit of time reviewing 1 Samuel before we wrap it up. I know Craig said last time we would wrap it up, but we should wrap it up this time and maybe get into 2 Samuel. So if you think about 1 Samuel and the book of Samuel, again, Craig inserted early on that originally they were one book, and for our convenience, if you will, it's been separated. You certainly see the story continue immediately from 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel without a break. But with that said, if you think about what the book really is, to me, it's history, it's religious history, but it's also a transition. You see the nation go from the end of the judges to having kings as the people demand it. One person kind of illustrated is it moved from what he called a loosely organized group of tribes, a theocracy, over to a centralized set of leadership that's centralized under a king, both of those being supported by God, or at least tolerated by God from a king's perspective. Anyway, so let's go through a quick review of each chapter. Let's just talk about anything that comes to mind. So we won't belabor that too much, but I thought it would help me as well as help you guys. We just kind of go back over where we've been, talk about what we know so far. I've got a perpetual cough, so I hope it doesn't flare up too much. It's been acting up on conference calls today. Okay, chapter 1. So the 1 Samuel, the book starts with Hannah and her vow. Hannah was barren, right, as we all know, and greatly desired to have a child, a son. And she goes, she's there and makes this prayer. She says, Lord of hosts, if you take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and forget me not, and give your servant a son, and I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. And then we know a little bit later that Samuel's born. She weans Samuel at an early age, takes him to Shiloh, where he lives with Eli and is in the house of God and is serving God there. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, Hannah's prayer. I know Craig spent a little bit of time talking about the prayer when we were in that chapter. Her prayer of thanksgiving that she was given a son, she was blessed by God. And also in that chapter we have the judgment of Eli and the pronouncement against Eli and his family. You recall, what were some of the key reasons why God pronounced judgment against Eli? His worthless sons, right? Okay. And Eli himself was a bit guilty in terms of he also partook of what this. He wasn't the instigator, if you will, to the primary, but he certainly participated, had some guilt in that area well, but primarily because of his sons and what his sons were doing in terms of profaning the worship and sleeping with the women, things like that. Okay, chapter 3, and then we see Eli in that scene where kind of in the middle of the night, right, God calls for Eli. I'm sorry, calls for Samuel. I'm going to do that. Wait till I get to Joab and Abner. We'll get those really mixed up. So he calls to Samuel, and a little bit back and forth, and ultimately Eli concludes, God's calling you, not me. Listen to him and do what he says. And God tells him basically he's going to judge Eli. And then Samuel tells Eli what God has said. And what was Eli's reaction to what God's judgment was? Remember that? Let him, yeah, he just, in my mind, just kind of shrugged, going, okay, he's God, and just kind of accepted it without, whether he repented from it. No indication, at least to me, that he did any of that. Just kind of like, okay, God's going to do what God's going to do, and okay, I'll live with the consequences, almost.
I guess in some ways, it's not a bad reaction. He would have expected, him to be mad at Samuel, or lash out, or something like that, or things like that. He recognized that he's at fault. The thing that's missing, though, is that there doesn't appear to be any repentance.
Right.
In what Eli, if Eli asks for forgiveness, it's not written.
Right. Yeah, makes me think of the contrast with David, right? When David sinned with Bathsheba and he's praying to God, God's basically said, I'm going to kill your son. He said, he appealed and begged for God not to do that. But when the son died, he kind of said, okay, God is God, and he did what he told me he was going to do. I asked for him to change his mind. He didn't, so I accepted. So, okay. But yeah, I hadn't thought about it from that perspective of it. He could have reacted worse than he did. Okay, chapter 4, then we see the ark captured by the Philistines. We see Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, killed in battle. And what's Eli's reaction to that when his sons are killed? The messenger comes and tells him about the battle. Falls backward, breaks his neck, and dies as well, just as God said it was going to. Okay. In chapter 5, then we see the ark with the Philistines. And that didn't go too well, did it, right? So one of my favorite scenes there that I kind of laugh every time I read is this image of Dagon, right? The ark is put inside the temple of Dagon, and then they come in the next morning and Dagon's bowing to God, right? Falling over on his face and on the floor. I think get all the details, right? Sets him back up, comes again. Next day, back on the floor, arms and legs broken, I think. Just cracks me up with God, basically just, in a pretty hilarious way, showing, you put my ark in your temple, claiming you defeated me, but just let me show you how this really works. Okay.
It's weird because you don't see the Philistines, seeing the army in that.
Yeah.
It's like, and good God has gone down to the Ark of the Covenant, by the way, and they can't get up by themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, maybe if I'm them, I kind of get it on the first day of, something caused it to fall over. But rinse and repeat, and next time fell over again and broken, something's going on there. So interesting, but I'll always get a good chuckle out of that story. All right, so the Philistines then start being afflicted by God, right? They have these tumors, and we see the ark go from spend some time in Ashdod, spend some time in Gath, and everybody kind of passes it along and says, not going well for me, you guys take it. And then it gets to Ekron, and Ekron kind of looks at the other Philistines going, what are you trying to do? Kill us, get this thing out of here. So that takes us to chapter 6, where the ark is returned, and the Philistines make restitution, if you will. Remember what they sent along with the ark? Tommy remembers. Yeah, in terms of a restitution to God and to the Israelites, they sent some things back along with the ark. Yeah, golden tumors, golden mice. not real attractive to me, to my mind, but that's what they did. And you know, then they built a new cart, had a couple of milk cows, and sent it on its way. Basically said, depending on where it goes, it either was by chance that we got sick, or if it goes this direction, it was from God. And of course, it went in the direction to God and went back to Israel. Then also there we, a little bit kind of gets lost, but the men of Beth Shemesh does a little bit of Raiders of the Lost Ark or whatever, Indiana Jones, right? Looks inside the ark and dies. Like 70 men died from that by not obeying God and not looking inside the ark. All right, chapter 7, then about 20 years go along, and interesting there, it tells us that Israel began to worship God again, or to seek God after a 20-year period. So Samuel tells them, okay, if you're going to do that, great, get rid of all your idols and worship God only. And of course they say, we will do that. They beat the Philistines in a battle at Mizpah, and there we see Samuel kind of judging Israel at the end of chapter 7. And then chapter 8, that towards the end of Samuel's life, Samuel's growing old. We see his sons, Joel and Abijah, they were judges in Beersheba, and they were just like Eli's son in terms of being dishonest and not being the kind of men that they should be, taking bribes, perverting justice, it tells us. So the elders of Israel come to Eli and say, you're old. You know, nice way to open up the conversation, right? You're getting old, but your sons aren't like you. They don't follow your example. So what do we want you to do? We want you to give us a king, just like all the other nations around us, so we can be just like them.
And in a way, it's kind of weird, because you sit there and you think about all the judges before, you don't necessarily see hereditary discussion with the other judges.
Right.
God, the Israelites are being attacked or ritual, whatever, and God raised up the judge.
Right.
So why did the people decide to position with Daniel to say, well, we're looking at your sons, and instead of waiting on God to raise up another judge, if you need one, we need one.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, did they just use that as a convenient excuse to get what they wanted? Maybe. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe it did. Maybe there's some indication they were going to be after Eli. I don't know. But an interesting point.
There's an insight here into the mindset of people spiritually, I think. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be in the Holy of Holies tabernacle and never seen by anybody except the high priest once a year.
Right.
And yet here they are pulling it out of there and carrying it to battle like it is an idol.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we did talk about that, but absolutely they were treating it that way.
And even after the fact, we're going to talk about David goes and gets it. He doesn't put it back in the tabernacle. He takes it to Jerusalem, puts it in a special tent. So there's I think God is trying to show us that there has been some loss of understanding of what he wanted them to do. And now their choice of a king is directly against his instruction. And yet, for some reason, he goes ahead and allows it.
Right.
So there's some accommodations going on here for some people who are not spiritually minded.
Yeah, no, very, very good. We see, as you said, God making that accommodation, but before he does, he warns them through Samuel. Here's what's going to happen if you have a king. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But remember the famous line, what does God tell Samuel when he talks to him about what's going on with the people?
They're not rejecting you,
right,
they're rejecting me.
Right. They're not rejecting you, they've rejected me as their king. That was God's main point. So again, Samuel tells the people at that point, here's what the king's going to do. He's going to take your sons and your daughters as servants. He's going to tax you. He's going to take 10%. He's going to take your best lands. And at some point, you're going to cry out and ask for God to help you. And God says, I'm not going to answer you. That's what's going to happen. And as we know, that is what happened. People, of course, in essence, say, I don't care. I want what I want, and I want a king. And so God accommodates and gives them a king. Of course, chapter 9 and 10, then we have Saul. Talk about tall, good looking, just what the world would expect from a king. And it's interesting how Saul started out to me of, being pretty humble, pretty shy, if you will. And then we see with pretty classic, with power comes the desire for more power, desire to keep power, and the corruption that comes along with that, and the downward spiral that Saul very quickly gets on and stays on to the end of his life. Okay. Chapter 11, the Ammonites lay siege to Jabesh Gilead. Another one of those things that just makes me ponder and scratch my head a little bit. If you remember that story, comes to him and says, we'll serve you. And he says, okay, gouge out your left eye. I forgot to look it up. Right eye, left-handed. I'm biased toward that. Gouge out, and their answer is, okay, give us a week, see if we can find somebody that can come out and beat you. Which is interesting take there, but what's crazy is the king says, okay. Why if you're I just never understood that. If you're in a battle, you're defeating someone, and they ask you, give me a week and see if I can go find somebody bigger, tougher than you. Okay, just interesting. I don't know, it's funny, it's interesting, and I don't know exactly why that transpired the way it did. So if you have some thoughts, that'd be interesting to know. But chapter 12, then Samuel makes his final speech to Israel, as you would expect, much like Joshua, in my mind, tells the people, reminds them, you've been greatly blessed by God. You need to fear the Lord, you need to worship him, you need to obey him. And then the warning, if you continue to sin, you're going to be swept away. And of course, they ultimately are swept away. Chapter 13, Saul attacks the Philistine garrison, and then there's this bigger battle brewing. If you remember from that chapter, Saul decides he can't wait for Samuel to come, right? And so he decides to offer the burnt offering. I want to read that section for just a couple. So beginning in second half of verse 10 through 14, just as he finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. So Saul came out to greet him, and Samuel asked, what have you done? Saul answered, when I saw the troops were deserting me, and you didn't come within the appointed days, and the Philistines were gathering at Mishmash, I thought, the Philistines will now descend on me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor, so I forced myself to offer the burnt offering. Samuel said to Saul, you've been foolish, you haven't kept the command which the Lord God gave you. It was this time that the Lord would have permanently established your reign over Israel, but now your reign will not endure. The Lord has found a man loyal to me, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not done what the Lord commanded. So, one of the things I think about as we start seeing this pattern with Saul that we're going to see repeated with him again of, it's not my fault, it's everybody else's fault. Troops are going to desert me, you didn't come, and we're going to see that repeated pretty soon with Saul again. So we're kind of seeing that, his mental makeup, if you will, it's not my fault, I did exactly what God told me, or at least somehow he convinced himself of that. So anyway, I just want to point that out, and then God's already telling him, you're going to lose your kingship, and I'm going to give it to somebody else. Chapter 14 is the story of Jonathan, the armor bearer, defeating the Philistines. If you remember, they go up and pretty much say, based on what they say, if they invite us up, we'll go because God's give them over to us, I believe is how that went. And of course, they invited up and they chase off the Philistines and defeat them. Also in that same chapter, we kind of had that rash vow of Saul, where he basically told his army, his soldiers, you can't eat at all throughout the day until I take my vengeance. And of course, his son Jonathan does that, not knowing that his father's made that vow of no one can take a food until the end of the day or until sunset. And Saul's reaction is, I've got to kill my son, right? And the people go, no, you're not. That would be interesting to see, how that transpired. But the people pretty much stood up to their king and said, no, you're not going to kill your son. You're not going to fulfill your vow. And Saul, appears to have accepted it, and there's no other commentary besides kind of they moved on. Anyway, pause there for a second. Any other thoughts? Okay. So chapter 15, again, we see more about Saul being rejected as king. There's the famous story of him not obeying God because of not killing all the Amalekites, saves some of the animals, right, and the king, Agag. And what does he do? Blames other people for his disobedience. It's their fault, it's not mine.
Right. He even goes a step further. He just said, well, they say it's the best for the Lord.
Right.
So it wasn't just, it was their fault, they're just not, we're doing it for the Lord.
Yeah. Seems like we've heard that line today, right? exactly, right. Yeah, absolutely. It's justified because I'm doing it for God. So it must be okay. It's okay with me, so it must be okay with him. Again, the idea of making God in our image instead of us in his image. Okay. And of course, the famous line that Samuel says to him, "And what's the sound of sheep and cattle I hear?" And he finally realizes his error. Chapter 16, David becomes anointed as king, but that was done. It wasn't done publicly; it was done privately. So David and those around, I guess, knew about it, but not everyone at that point. And then we're told the Spirit of the Lord left Samuel. Remember what else we're told there? God sent a tormenting spirit that we see have its effect on Saul in the coming days and coming years of that. So I kind of forget about that sometimes. Then we see David become Saul's armor bearer, and Saul start having these, I don't know if they're moods of depression or what exactly, I forget what I should call them. But David comes in, plays the lyre, and that soothes Saul. So he has these kind of fits. David comes, plays, and kind of calms him down. So interesting. Chapter 17, of course, is the famous story our kids and everybody knows about Goliath being defeated. Chapter 18, we see Jonathan and David make a covenant. And then we see the people start influencing Saul. And they sing that song that we all know about, right? Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. And Saul's reaction is jealousy, right? He doesn't like that at all. He sees David as becoming, I think, a contender to usurp him and take his place, and he's more popular than I am with the crowd. And, my ego is not going to take that. So I become jealous, and I start trying to take David out. There in that chapter, I think the first time we see Saul try to actually kill David by they're in, I think, the dining area together, and Saul throws a spear and misses. So I start chuckling, Dave, like, is Saul the first stormtrooper, right? He can't ever hit anything. Because over and over again, he tries to kill him by throwing spears at him, but he's always missing. So I don't know. Anyway, there David also marries Michal, the son of Saul. Remember that you can marry my daughter if you get 100 foreskins of the Philistines, and David says no problem. He brings back twice the amount, brings back 200, and marries her. Chapter 19, we see Saul, again, attempting to kill David. This time his wife, Michal, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, helps him escape, and he gets away. Chapter 20, Jonathan and David, we see them, and that's the scene where basically Jonathan says, "Come out tomorrow, if I recall, I'll shoot arrows and as a signal to you whether it's safe or whether it's not safe and you need to get away." And of course he, if I recall, overshoots, tells the young lad to run past, and David knows Saul's trying to kill me, I've got to get away. 21, David flees to Nob and interacts with Ahimelech, the priest there. And then we start seeing this as the scene where he goes to Gath and starts acting insane to protect himself. Chapter 22 then is where Saul has Doeg kill the 85 priests from the previous chapter and sins in that way. So, yeah, and a great character by Saul. 23, David defeats the Philistines. Saul pursues him, kind of, 25 through 28 or 27 or so is this back and forth, the continuing narrative of David escaping, Saul chasing him, David, kind of rinsing and repeating that story. And a couple times in there, though, we did see David spare Saul's life. The first time in the cave, where he could have killed him, and the men basically said, why did you kill him? He's your enemy. And what was David's response? He's the Lord's anointed, right? That's up to God to do. And I'm not going to do it. We're going to see that a different take on that here tonight or next time. And then the second time is when David kind of sneaks into the camp at night while Saul is sleeping, takes his spear, takes his water jug, and basically calls out going, "Again, I could have killed you. I'm not your enemy. Your army should have protected you." Kind of story there. And then we see David flee. Chapter 27, 28 is the famous story with Saul and the medium and the witch of Endor, I think as we call her. And then 29, where we spent most of last week, was David not being allowed to go out by the lords of the Philistines and fight because they didn't trust him, which is probably a good thing. Okay, so that's 1 through 29 recap. I know that probably was maybe a little more than we wanted to go over, but I'm trying to personally get better at understanding and documenting kind of chapter by chapter, and helps me learn a little better. So I thought it'd be a good time spent. Any thoughts on 1 through 29, the things we didn't cover that you really, find interesting or we want to talk about before we move on?
I think it's interesting that how God uses people to get them to see the way He sees, or the way He thinks. So you think about it like, for example, people want to be king, but it's not to be king. So you get a king like the people thought the king should live on.
Right.
And that is what God does. So God says, I'll tell you what, I'll choose the king. This going to be a king like and so you need to see the contrast between King 1. The people thought looked like a king, but really didn't act like a king. Versus King 2, God looks at the heart, and if somebody is a man after God's own heart, who truly is a king, not only a king in looks and appearance, but also in action. And so he's done favor those people, so it shows up other than
Yeah. Yeah, you would hope and think the people could have seen that stark contrast between, here's what you wanted, I gave it to you, saw what it resulted in, here's much more of what I would give you, and David, and the difference there, and the way they led, the way they acted in their lives, and their personalities, their morality, and all of that, right? Just sharp contrast between those two people. Hopefully they got it. But like us, maybe they didn't. Nearly yeah.
Still, God's laying the groundwork for what
Yep.
But it's like we talked about Barry talked about the other day, the fact that, some of the things that David did, it was kind of hard to explain, He's right there among the Philistines. He's going out, fighting out our people.
Yeah.
Good. But he's still
Yeah, it is interesting because we see all David's weaknesses and his failures, and in our mind, or at least in my mind, I shouldn't project on other people, right? I hear man after God's own heart, and I expect this almost perfection in a physical sense, and we certainly don't see that. And we know that, and I know that, but still sometimes it's just what you see versus what God tells us about David's heart. Sometimes a little, have to pause and rectify that, or make those two things match, at least in my mind. I know last week we did get through part of 30, but I don't think we got all the way, so I thought we'd just catch up a little bit and then finish out the chapter here in the time that we have left. So again, just kind of go through the narrative of where we are. So the Amalekites have raided Negev. They burned down the town David was living in. Ziklag, I believe, takes everybody captive, takes all the property, right? They've taken David's plunder and taken it for themselves and gone back. So David, a couple days later, David and his men come to town and see the town burned down and everything gone. And the reaction of the people or his men was what?
Mad at David.
Mad at David. To the point of they were thinking about stoning David. Which is, I try to think that's pretty typical human reaction of I'm mad. It's somebody's fault. David, it's your fault, right? They don't get to the point, obviously, of trying to stone him, but they were, and David was obviously very concerned because he was like, I could lose my life here. These 600 men want to stone me. So what does David do at that point that we're told? What's that? He prays, he turns to God, right? He doesn't grab his, spear and say, man, we gotta chase these people immediately and catch up with them and take matters into our own hand. He pauses and asks God, what should I do? Should I chase them? I wonder what would happen if God said no, except that everything's gone, but that's not what God told him to do. So he gets the priest, he tells him to bring the ephod, and we're going to inquire of the Lord, should we pursue these raiders? And of course God says, yes, pursue them, you will catch them, you will get everything back. You're going to succeed and not lose anything, either people or material possessions. So they do catch up, they get to this wadi, I forget the name of it, but basically get to that 200 of David's men are so tired they can't go any further. So, okay, you stay here, stay with the supplies. The other 400 will go up and catch up with them, and we'll come back. So they encounter an Egyptian slave who had been abandoned by his Philistine master because he'd gotten sick a couple days ago. So great master, right? Just, well, you're a possession, and I don't need you anymore because you're sick and you're holding me up. So, I'll toss you to the side, and we'll go on. But he does encounter that, and David asks him, will you help me get to these raiders? And he says, basically swear to me by God that you won't kill me or turn me over to my master, and I'll lead you to them. Of course, David says, yes, I will. So they catch up with the Amalekites and slaughtered them, and David and his men recover all the people. So David gets his wives back, all the men get their families back, they get all their stuff back, plus they get now the plunder that the Amalekites have been raiding Judah, if I recall, and the Philistines. So they have plunder from the raiding and activity they've been doing. So they're pretty set in terms of material possessions. So David gets extra stuff, if you will. So then in the story, they get back to where they left the 200 men, and there's a bit of conflict there. Remember what happens next between the 400 men that went to raid and go into battle and the 200 that stayed.
The ones that went into battle didn't think the 200 that stayed should get anything.
Right. Other than, we'll give you your families back, but we did the hard stuff, right? You sat here and rested, and putting words in their mouth. But I think that was their point of, we did the real work. We get to keep the stuff.
And I mean, I would say that. I would probably be in the 400 and be like, why did I just went and fought and did everything? They were too tired. Why don't let's give them their stuff, let them go home.
Yeah.
I think that's our human nature.
I think that's right, yeah. That'd probably be my reaction too of, wait a second, I deserve more, right?
Or at least you don't deserve as much as I did. I worked harder.
Yeah. New Testament story that comes to mind based on that? Yeah.
They work longer, the laborers in the vineyard.
Yeah. I have to remind myself of that story, seems like every year or so, because I want to be frustrated about something's not fair. Then I got to remember that story. It says, it was mine to give. Why are you upset about what I chose to give, right? Kind of the same thing here. David says, no, we all share in this equally. They did their part. Their part was, in essence, we left supplies. You can kind of deduce from that. We left supplies with them. They took care of them. They were our supply chain to fight the battle, if you will. And so they served an important role. And, we're not going to do it that way. And even to the point of, we're going to make this a law. It's going to be an ordinance within Israel from now on that sharing equally in that type of situation is the way it's going to be. Yeah, Brandy.
I think it's important to understand that you don't know the whole story of the 200 men who were left behind. They may have been the fighting warriors that had been beside David for however long they were gone. And they were exhausted. And the 400 who then went out with him at the final battle could have been the ones who hadn't fought at all throughout the whole engaged time that they were gone. You don't know.
Right.
But that seems to be the case for a lot of people, even in Christianity. They look at people who come to God late, and they say, why do they get the same reward that I get? I've been at it my whole life, and here I'm exhausted, and I don't know if you can continue, but these people, they're new to it, and look how much energy they have. And there's a lot of correlation between our daily spiritual fight and the one that they currently have in this story.
Yeah, good. You kind of touched on one of the things I want to bring out is kind of the parallels between that story and kind of the parallels between us and the church today, right? Of everybody does their part, whether it's publicly and seen, by Craig or the elders or whatever case, versus all those who we never know about that spend, time in prayer, time helping out others that we never know about, right? It's just done in privately, but we all have our role. We all contribute. That kind of made me think about that and those parallels today. Brent, the other thought, we certainly see David not react and go along with the men. He's like, he didn't tell those 200 people when they were leaving, like, you guys are worthless, just stay here because I don't need you. He doesn't handle it in a negative, you're right, you're not as good as these other 400, so stay behind so you don't slow me down or harm me, right? He takes a positive approach.
These are all the men that came to David. They were part of his group, his brothers or whatever. But verse 22, you get an insight that said all the wicked and worthless men among those that went. So they weren't all the necessarily stellar people.
Yeah, perfect. That's, I wanted to call that out. I forget. I just think, oh, these are men kind of like David, right? They're just mini Davids. They're not quite as good as David, but they're not. They were apparently some scoundrels in that crowd. I'm sure some were good, some weren't. Alan and then Lori.
I think it's interesting that, David's going to become king before too long. I don't know how many years it's going to pass, days or months, but I know in chapters, there's just a few more chapters.
Right.
This chapter is really a lot of good leadership. He went to God. If he doesn't go to God to ask if he should pursue these men, he just pursues them. It might not end his way.
Right.
He goes to God. God tells him yes. Then he deals with the conflict internally. I mean, there's a lot of good things that the people are seeing out of him as a leader, which is going to bode well for him becoming the next king.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's a coincidence this is happening the way it is or not, but it's interesting that it's right before he's going to become.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And the end of the chapter is actually going to kind of talk about that as well. Lori, you had a comment?
Kind of going along with what Alan's saying, I noticed the leadership part and stopping and going, okay, let's talk about this, and them listening to him and doing it, and which made me think too, so many times I've asked myself and haven't gotten the answer, why God appointed him king. You're appointed king way back here, but then you're going to spend the next, somewhere I read that was like 8 years, but I don't know where I got the 8 years from, but every so many years you're going to spend running, and Saul's going to do this, and you're not, it's not going to come easy. And I always wondered why God did that. Why not just appoint him king just like he did everyone else and then make him king? So you're out of there.
Right.
But maybe it's because of all of this learning experience and all this growing he had to do during all this time, everything he faced, everything he did, maybe prepared him better to lead and to be a better king. Yeah,
I have no doubt that it did. I really haven't thought about that other than, I think occasionally David had to get so old of just running for my life, and to the point of, I'm supposed to be your king, and year after year I'm running for my life and dodging this guy. And always wondering, I'm sure there's in the back of his mind of, am I going to die, or is God going to really see me through? Which is just a good example of God's timing. It's not the same timing as our timing. Yeah, very good. But that's another hand. Okay. So again, kind of wrapping up the chapter then. So David comes back with his family, with all the material, with his men, get back to the town of Ziklag, and then he sends plunder to the elders of Judah, which to me is kind of tags on to what Alan was saying of being a good leader. I kind of made a note of, why in the world did David do that? Why would he take, the plunder that he had gotten and give it away to gifts? Looks like Stuart has a thought. What's that? Alliances?
These are people who are already in the town, places that he's going to be king over. And he gets their goodwill. Makes it easier to transition out.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that's probably, any other thoughts on that? The other thing that I read that made sense to me was, if you remember, David's been off for a while, pretending at least to be on the Philistine side. So surely there's some understanding of, can we trust David? David's been with our enemy and stuff. So I think this is part of building that relationship back and showing them. I forget that I didn't write down what David said, but he made comment in there to that effect of, you can trust me, we can have a relationship together. But I think that's what he's doing, is building back those strained relationships that surely some of those elders kind of had raised eyebrows about what's going on with David. He's been over with our enemy for a while. And was he really over there? Was he hiding out? Who knows what was in their mind? But surely they had some questions about David. So I think that's part of him being a good leader, maybe even a good politician. I hate to even say that, but there's some not craftiness, but wisdom on his part to do that.
There's nothing that tells us that God didn't have anything to do with him going to the Philistines. I don't think it's true. Is there anything that tells us God was not supportive of that? The only reason I ask that is, here he is inquiring of God in this situation. And why would God, care about him if he wasn't doing what he wanted him to do? And not that he still wouldn't answer, give him an answer, but It just, I don't know, I just question whether maybe there's something we don't know to that whole thing.
Maybe, I don't recall, I did recall reading something a little bit that kind of talked about, just that this bird's opinion, that David had kind of backslid, if you will, a little bit, and doing his own thing more than trusting in God, while he's, again, don't know, maybe not, but that was their point, of he's kind of coming back, strengthening his relationship with God again by going to him in this situation.
Okay.
Don't know, just someone's thought. Anything else on chapter 30? All right, we'll wrap up here. We've got about 10 minutes, so timing is pretty good. So chapter 31, end of the book. So we have another battle between Israel and the Philistines. And in that battle, Saul's killed. All three of Saul's sons are killed. And, I get ahead of myself a little bit. First, Saul's three sons are killed. And then they pursue Saul, and he's wounded by archers of the Philistines. So he's not immediately killed, but shot with one or more arrows. And it's pretty clear he's mortally wounded by what he says and what we see a little bit later. So based on that, Saul realizes, I'm going to die. I'm not going to survive these wounds, right? So he calls out to his armor bearer, come here, draw your sword, kill me, put me out of my misery, in essence. Because if you don't, the Philistines are going to catch up with me. They're going to kill me, but they're also going to torture me. So just let me avoid the torture of the Philistines and go ahead and die, because I'm going to anyway. And armor bearer tells us he was too terrified, too scared. He doesn't do it. In hindsight, he probably wishes he had, right? But he doesn't do it. So Saul takes out his own sword and kills himself, appears to have run himself through there. And then the armor bearer looks at, now Saul's dead, and ends up doing the same thing. So Saul's dead, all the sons are dead. Now the armor bearer is dead as well. Any other things you guys picked up that I kind of missed in that narrative there? Okay, so what's happening with Israel? Israel sees the results of the battle, sees that they've lost, and they start fleeing. They flee the cities, whether they're on the other side of the Jordan or this side, that they all basically take away, flee the area, and the Philistines come in and basically take over the cities that they've abandoned. So they've got these cities kind of ready to go that they can just inhabit and live in. So next day, the Philistines come back out to, as it said, my version said to strip the dead, and I think they were simply coming out to take all the plunder, right? All the things that they had left in the heat of the battle off the dead bodies, and acquire all those material possessions. So they find Saul, they find his sons, cut off Saul's head, take his armor, and then send out messengers out throughout all the lands of the Philistines, telling the good news that they defeated the Israel king, and Saul is dead. So then they take Saul's armor, they put it in the temple of the Ashtaroths, and then remember what they do with Saul's body? Yeah, not yet. Those are actually the men that rescued, kind of Israelites that came, did that. But yeah, they took him to their city and kind of said, look, here's the spoil of our battle, here's their king. And we cut off his head, and there he hangs. So one thing I read is that was kind of an ultimate act of humiliation, that if he had been alive, Saul would have been incredibly humiliated by the fact that his body was hung up there. And the nation of Israel was being humiliated by the fact their king is hung there, beheaded and defeated, and hung on the Philistines' wall for everybody to see. I think, maybe it's a stretch, but I think it's also a little bit of, my God has defeated your God again. My thought, again, it doesn't say that, but that seemed reasonable to me as well. So then, as Diane was talking about, men come from Jabesh, Gilead, recover the body of Saul, recover the body of his sons, burn their bodies, take the bones, bury them, and kind of give them a proper burial at that point. So it was interesting. Saul had a connection with these men from Jabesh, Gilead, back in 1 Samuel 11. They were from that story of, I'll gouge out your right eye, unless you can find someone to defeat me. So those are men that Saul had come and rescued that city. So they had, I guess, an affinity for Saul as an appreciation for his saving them a while back in that story.
I believe that Ray Gilead is on the other side of the Jordan. That he,
Crossover.
they're going all out, they're crossing the river too, going all out to get wherever this place is, and to bring down Saul and his son's body, and, you know, that.
It was, yeah, I'd kind of forgotten about that detail. It was clear, it wasn't just go a block and pick up the body and you're done, right? It was a journey and a commitment on their part to make that happen.
The original covert operation.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, any other thoughts from chapter 31? So what are the big lessons from 1 Samuel that you guys, we should take away? What are the applications for us in the last couple of minutes we have?
We had to trust our God.
Yep, so didn't hear Kitty, have to trust in God. Yep.
Don't trust in, don't make idols of things God told you not to make idols. I refer to the Ark of the Covenant, trying to bring the Ark of the Covenant. That, like you said earlier, that became their little idol. But they weren't even supposed to see it. Nobody was supposed to see it, except for the high priest. So, what were they doing that? You see this played out later on when, Paul and Jerusalem studied Ezekiel. And they said, well, we're not going to be captured until we have, God, sure, that's happening. No matter how you do that.
Right.
And people don't understand that's not the way God is. God still expects his people to act the way he wants you to act. And just because God is in your midst, in the sense that his throne is there, doesn't mean he won't leave. And if you choose not to follow him, he'll leave.
Yeah, very good. You look like you had a comment. Okay.
It surprised me that in this society where the men are the rulers and all that you have two women that you have Hannah and Abigail that greatly changed the course of action, and they're very good women, but we have no narrative, we know about that.
Yeah.
In their society then.
Yeah, good. I hadn't thought about that. Okay. Alan had kind of touched on the other bullet point I put down about, the leadership lessons that we can get, both good, primarily from David, and then poor leadership from Saul, and the things we can look at their stories, how they conducted themselves, and make application about leading our families, leading, out in the world and things like that. And the last thing I put down is just, we know this, right? But see the consequences of sin. Saul sins and sins in the other. We're going to see it more and more in 2 Samuel as well. But we know that, but always a reminder there of what happens when you disobey God, go against God, and sin against him. Okay, we got folks out there, so thanks for the participation and the help wrapping up 1 Samuel. We'll pick up 2 Samuel next Wednesday.
We're going to sing Abide With Me. It's number 308 in the songbook, if you're using that, or up on the screen here. And we're not going to sing all 6 verses. We'll just sing 1, 2, 4, and 6. So just follow along there. Hopefully I get it right. That's it.
Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Thank you for coming out for a period of Bible study. Let's remember we come together again Sunday morning, 9 a.m. for worship. I don't really have any new announcements. It's good to see Tommy and Betty back with us. Glad you guys made it back safely. Christy's still out of town traveling, so keep her in your prayers. Both Shirley and Craig are at home, recovering from COVID-like symptoms. Keep them in your prayers. And I want to mention again, there's going to be a memorial for Lucas's mom, Carol Griggs. It'll be held on Sunday, February the 20th at 2 p.m. in the downtown Church of Christ church building in Rogers. And please keep Lucas and his family in your prayers. Anything else needs to be mentioned? Okay, we'll be closed in prayer.
Pray with me, please. Dear God, thank you for blessing us with another day that we're able to come out here and worship you. Please help everything that we have done tonight be edifying in your eyes. Please be with everybody in the announcements. Please give them comfort. Please be with the Griggs family as they go through this hard time. Please just be with them and give them comfort and to get through these hard times. Please be with everyone on the roads today and everybody who is sick. Please be with them, heal them, and please help us to always strive to want to grow towards you. Please help us to never take for granted all the wonderful things that you've blessed us with. Please help us to always want to be a shine light for everyone. Please help us to never darken that light, because you don't know when people are watching you. Please help us to always be that shine light and that example that your son was. And it's in your son's name I pray. Amen.